Summer, we are going through the whole Bible, and the text that we're using is called a book called 30 Days to Understanding the Bible. So we're going to do a review. The first era is the era God looked on everything, and he made out of nothing creation, right? That's the first era. Who's the main dude of the creation? Adam, because he's a great craftsman. Adam, and we are in the Garden of Eden. All right, so that's the first 11 chapters of Genesis. Then we go from the creation era to the era of the Don't answer, Margaret. Don't answer because you'll be wrong. We did this on Father's Day, the era of the Good, that's much better. This side is a lot more verbal than this side. The era of the Wonderful. Who's the first patriarch father?
Abraham.
Father Abraham, and then he has a son that's laughter. His name is Isaac, and Isaac has a pair of twins, but the one that we're going to follow is the trickster. His name is Jacob. Jacob has a bunch of kids. We are going to follow the 12 of them, 12 sons, and he has a favorite. His favorite is Joseph. And that's how we get from Canaan to Egypt. So now we're in Egypt because remember Joseph got sold into slavery, and then we have the famine that happens and everybody follows over there. And then I asked you to hold that page between the book of Exodus and the book of Genesis. How many years is that page? 400 years. And now we are going into the next era. So the first era is what?
Creation.
First era is what?
Creation.
Good. My hearing on this side is getting a little. Creation. The second era is Patriarchs. The third era is all right, the signs in the back. The next era is what? Exodus. Who's the main dude of the Exodus? Moses. Remember, Moses gets the law from God. God gets and then the people disobey the law, and so they wander around in the wilderness for how many years? 40 years at the edge of the Jordan River on the east bank. It's flood stage. Moses is there. Joshua is there. Does Moses go across? No. Instead, God's sending who? Joshua, Yeshua, which means God saves. And now we have Joshua, and he's going to go across the Jordan River. Remember, God stops up that river because the Levites are holding the Ark of the Covenant. Once they touch the river stops. They go across. They take the city of Jericho, and from there they continue to go across from the Jordan River all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. So they divide and conquer. Then God tells to Joshua, I want you to divide up all this land here, and everybody's going to get a parcel, except that Joseph is going to get two. He gets a double portion, and we don't have a tribe that we call Joseph anymore. We have two tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim, and one of the tribes don't get any, no land whatsoever. That tribe is the tribe of the Levites, and your job is to? Okay. What is your job again? Again? Take care of the Levites, because the Levites are the priests. They didn't get any land. So the Levites are the priests. No land. They just get a Menard's big chair. All right. So now the Levites they don't get any land, but now everybody has their own land. All the tribes, and I don't know if you can imagine this, but now they start to have some squabbles. Different family tribes have different squabbles. And they all start to say, all these other lands around us, they have different kinds of leaders, so we need some leaders. So God calls and sends them a judge. We are now in the era of the judges. And do you remember who the famous judge of all is, the really strong guy? Samson. What I really want you to remember from the judges is this, is we have this cycle that goes over and over and over again. The cycle is this. Israel calls on God. God sends a judge. Everything goes well for a while, and then they continue to start to sin. And when they reach their bottom, they cry out, God, save us. God sends another judge. Things get better. And once they get better, then they start to get worse again. And they keep going cycle and over and over and over again. And the most telling part is this. At the end of the book of Judges, you remember we read that last week, there was that story about how the Benjaminites didn't get enough women to keep their clan going. And so they decided, all these assemblies decided that the best thing to do is to get the women of Shiloh to be the Benjaminites' wives. They didn't ask God. They just said, okay, once the women of Shiloh come dancing out, everybody go ahead and take somebody and take her home and make her your wife. But the very last verse is what sums up the book of Judges. And that is, at that time there was no king of Israel, and everybody did as they saw fit. Doesn't happen today. Which leads us to today. The book, the era of the kingdom, the monarchy, kingdom, whatever you want. If you want to call it kings, I don't care, but here's where we are. So in the era of the judges, all the Israelites were going, everybody around us, they have a king. We don't have no king. When they ask, well, who do you have? We have to say, well, we have a stinking judge. That's the really living version, remember? And they cry out. They say, Lord, we want a king. And so the last of the judges and the first of the prophet, his name is Samuel. Now, Samuel I would invite you to read 1 Samuel. It's a really cool story about how he is given up by his mother. His mother's barren, and she wants to have a child. And when she does have this child, she says, I'll dedicate my child to God, and that's Samuel. So Samuel goes and he prays to God. He says, God, your people want a king. And God says to Samuel, listen, they don't want a king. This is what will happen. They'll get taxed. The king will take whatever he cares to. And the other thing is they don't want to listen to a king any more than they want to listen to you, but they'll have to listen to a king. So you really tell them they don't want a king. So Samuel, well, you don't want a king. Yes, we want a king. And so they had a poll. And they said, we want a king. Everybody else is a king. We want a king. So God says to Samuel, all right, they won't like it, but I'll give them a king. Their first king is King Saul. Now, Saul is, you're going to hear that name again. Saul is not the same Saul that we find in the New Testament who gets his name changed to Paul. Saul is anointed by God as king. It ends up that Saul does exactly what God predicts that Saul will do, and he starts to screw up. So God says, all right, we need another king. So he taps Samuel on the shoulder and says, I want you to go to Jesse. Now, Jesse is out, he's in Bethlehem. And so here comes Samuel. And when Jesse sees Samuel, he knows something's up. Everybody knows who Samuel is. Everybody. It's like Morgan Freeman, okay? He's in every single movie. All right, so everybody knows who oh man, Samuel's coming. So they get everybody around, and Samuel says, Jesse, I am here on behalf of God because the next king of Israel will come from your house. So Jesse says, all right, well, I got a lot of sons, but I'm sure this is the one you want. So he brings out his oldest son. Samuel looks at him and says, hey, he's a pretty good-looking kid. All right, well, I'm sure. And he goes, but I better check with God. God says to Samuel, this is not the one I've chosen. Sam checks and says, look at him. He looks like a king. He'll do well on television. Men look at appearances from the outside, but God looks at the heart. So that one is rejected. Literally all the sons of Jesse are rejected, and there's nobody left. And Samuel says, there's got to be somebody left. I was sent here by God to anoint the next king. Where do you have any more sons? Oh, well, there's David, but you don't want him. Now, he's the youngest. He's out with the sheep. He's been kind of a trouble. You don't want him. And Samuel says, go get him. Now, notice Samuel checks with God every single time to see if that one is going to be king. And he doesn't even know if David is the one who's supposed to be king. He says, Jesse, just bring him in. So David comes in. God says to Samuel, this is who I want as king. So Samuel anoints David as king. Now, David isn't going to become the king of Israel for at least another 25 years. So he's going to wait around. Who would ever think to anoint a child as king? Now, some of you know about David. He had, remember, when he becomes king, he's up on the rooftop and he sees a good-looking woman across the street who's taking a bath. And so he says, why don't you have her come over to my house? And then she comes over. And what's her name, anybody? She's taking a bath. Her name is? All right, taking a bath. Bathsheba. Then she comes a little bit later and says, David, I hate to tell you this, but I'm going to have a kid, and it's yours. So David goes, So he comes up with this ingenious plan because her husband, Uriah, is out in the military battle, so he calls Uriah in and tries to get Uriah to come so it looks like it's Uriah's kid, but that didn't work. Uriah says, well, nobody else can be with their wife, so I'm not going to be with my wife. And he's going, oh, good night. That's all I need is some goody two-shoes. All right, you go on out. And then he finally says, all right, what I want you to do is when everybody's in the heat of battle, everybody draw back except for Uriah. Uriah dies in battle because David arranged it. So David basically becomes a murderer, right? Nice king. You'll find that David also, he's the strangest, best king of Israel that you would ever think of. Because there are many times when he screws up. But when he screws up, instead of making excuses like Saul does, David goes before God and says, God, I've made a mess of things, and I need you. And God listens to him. God says that David is the apple of his eye. Now, friends, if David is the apple of God's eye, has anyone here tried to commit murder before? Please don't answer yes. David is the apple of God's eye. I think we could be the apple too. Now, as the kings go, I mean, David is the one who's most heralded. David has a lot of sons, but he has a favorite as well. He and Bathsheba have another kid. Their first child dies. Their second child, though, is King, does anyone know? King Solomon. Remember, God says to Solomon, Solomon, I'll give you anything you ask for, absolutely anything you want to. And what does Solomon say that he wants? Wisdom. God says you have chosen wisely. And so Solomon becomes the richest king in Israel's history. Now, one of the ways that he does that is he forms alliances with all these other countries around with him. And with every alliance, their practice back then was, in order to show that you had an alliance with a country, if you were the king, you would make a queen of that other, so you'd marry another person from that country. So Solomon had all kinds of wives and concubines and other assorted arrangements. And Solomon is the one who writes the book of Ecclesiastes. If you have some time today, I invite you to take a look at Ecclesiastes. You will find that Solomon didn't find so much happiness with all of his money, with all of his riches, or with all of his wives. In fact, it really doesn't sum up very well about what he's, in essence, he's saying, I think life is just folly. I find that interesting. It's included in our scripture. Because there are times, friends, when even I go, God, what is going on? Are you even around? And I think that's what Solomon was thinking. I mean, he had everything in the world at his disposal, but he still wasn't happy. Well, Solomon has a bunch of kids. And what happens, he says, well, this son is going to succeed me when I die. But he has a bunch of other sons that want to succeed him as well. So when Solomon dies, all these sons have this big explosion of who's supposed to be king. And so they have a fight. Now, I'm sure it doesn't happen today anymore, but sometimes I've been at funeral planning, never for somebody from a church, oh heavens, no, not that. But where families will come into the funeral planner's room, and some of them will sit over here on this side, and some of them will sit over here on this side, and you're going through and saying, okay, well, let's see, now, is this person here? Oh no, he won't step foot in here. We won't have him be here. He's your brother, right? Don't even say his name. Oh, wonderful. You know what's going to happen after the funeral, don't you? You wonder if they're going to make it through the funeral at all. That's what happened to Solomon's family. You see, what happens is all these sons decide that they want to be king, and so they all claim that they want to be king, and so there's this big civil war that happens in Israel. Now, the northern kingdom is the 10 tribes of Israel, and they have a bunch of kings that follow after Solomon. None of them are good. And so the northern kingdom gets dispersed fairly quickly. We call them the lost tribes of Israel. The southern kingdom, there are 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin. Now, we have some kings in that succession that are better than others, but for the most part, they still neglect to follow God. Now, it's not that they aren't getting told. In fact, God says, all right, well, they're not even calling on me. They're not even dialing 911 when there's an emergency anymore. At least the judges did that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send some prophets to them. So God sends prophets. Those are people like Ezekiel and Jeremiah and Isaiah and Hosea and Amos and Malachi and all those at the end of the Old Testament that you can't pronounce. All right? Those prophets come in and this is what they tell the people of Israel. Either you shape up or God's going to ship you out. And do you think the people of Israel heard what the prophets said? No. Time and time they reject them. In fact, sometimes they don't like what that prophet says, so they call in their own prophets in order to try to get them to say something else. This never happens anymore today. I've never watched anything on the news like that at all. And so the 2 kingdoms split. And the southern kingdom, Judah. Now I want you to, what is a Jew called today? What is their faith? Judaism. Judaism. Judah and Benjamin are the last. But they get exported over to Babylon. And that ends the kingdom. There are no more kings in Israel anymore because they don't really have a country anymore. They've been evicted. So what does that say to us today? Well, I think it says a lot. Because not much has changed. Now, God did send another king, right? The kids even told us that. The king is who? Oh, good night, please. The king is who? Jesus. And unlike anything else, Jesus says, all right, I am going to take on every last bad thing that you do, and I am going to take that on for myself. I am going to pay the cost. And so on the cross, the King of Kings takes away our sin. All we have to do is accept the gift of grace. And it's free. And Jesus comes from this long line of kings. Now, I want you to remember where that king, that very first king, let's not go with Saul. I want you to think about David. When he's this high, that's who God anoints to serve as the king of Israel. Why do you think God chose a kid? Why do you think he chose a shepherd? Someone who watches over the sheep. Why do you think that he chose David over any of the other ones? He was a servant. He was willing to hear what God had to say. Now, David is not exemplary, right? But every time he falls away, he comes back before God and says, God, I made a mess of stuff. Fix my heart. Rule in me. We, friends, are princes and princesses. We are the children of the King. And we are here as God's ambassadors. And I think, my friends, it's time like we start behaving like it. And God's people said, Amen. Let's stand.